It's a very, very difficult situation. The worst part of the budget was to predict inflation rates of over 50%. That's not serious budget making. They were not prepared for the severity of the sanctions. They underestimated what the United States could do in terms of limiting oil sales and other Iran's foreign trade.
Public frustration over rising living costs and an ongoing currency crisis in Iran has once again spilled into protests across the country. Increased efforts by the Trump administration to limit Iran's oil exports, as well as the war with Israel in June, have also contributed to the worsening economy. To talk us through this, I'm joined by Djavad Salehi-Isfahani. He's a professor at Virginia Tech and an expert on the Iranian economy. Welcome, Djavad. It's great to talk to you again. Inflation in Iran surged to more than 43% last year. Sanctions are wreaking havoc on the economy. What options does the Iranian government have to resolve this crisis quickly?
Not many, I must say, because what the demonstrators are demanding, the government has been struggling with them, and they're not really under the control of the government. They have been trying to lower inflation rates. Instead, we saw this past few months, inflation increased maybe by 50%. So the inflation in November ran at an annual rate of 72%. So I don't know if there is the economic means to stabilize prices, stabilize the exchange rate. Iranians are unable to export oil, you mentioned that, but they're also unable to export anything else. So usually when you don't export oil and your currency drops, your other products become cheaper internationally, and then you can substitute non-oil exports for oil exports. That route is also close to Iran. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And unless the sanctions are somehow eased, Iran or some other countries like China come to the rescue of Iran and defy the United States. They have to do that because U.S. secondary sanctions constrain Chinese trade with Iran as well.
So it's a bit of a grim picture for the government right now. How would you characterize this? I mean, you've obviously been following this very closely for years and over the years. And is this the most serious we've seen it? I mean, is this, we mentioned maybe earlier talking about historic proportions. Would you see this as a very serious challenge?
Without doubt, is the most serious challenge. And it is serious because the government's not able to meet the demands. When the disputed elections, the young people in 2009, government had options to promise new elections. They didn't compromise, but at least they seemed in control because they had the cards in their hands. Most recently, the largest protests came as a result of the women fighting the forced compulsory hijab in Iran, the Mahsa Amini uprisings. Even there, the government had the cards in its hands. The protests were about arresting women in the streets and pulling them into vans and taking them to re-education centers. And the government could just stop that. And it did. So when you looked at from the vantage point of those protests as they were going on, you could see that the government could pull back and the protests might subside. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Luckily, at the time, the war hadn't taken place with Israel. So Iran's economy was not as battered. Investment was not so scarce. The threat of another attack by Israel and perhaps by the United States has scared away investment and has encouraged capital flight. So people are putting their money in dollars, in gold, and those prices surge. All that is part of an economic crisis that did not exist in 2022 when the Mahsa Amini protests raged. but now exist. And on top of all that, it's not clear if the government is in a position to address the demands of the demonstrators credibly. They've put into bank accounts quite a bit of money, I would say, in terms of the purchasing power. 4 million, 2 months per month per person is a considerable amount, and it definitely staves off hunger and so on. But that's not all that the demonstrators are looking for. There's so many other demands, like for jobs, for young people, having a more rational distribution of the government revenues for domestic versus external reasons. All those things are very hard to address under the circumstances amidst the crisis.
And if we break it down a little bit, there's this draft budget for the next fiscal year, which starts in March, and that foresees huge spending increases on security, with a disproportionate chunk of oil export revenues going to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. How do we read such a big spend on security and military institutions?
I would say the increase in military expenditures was inevitable because Iran was battered in a 12-day war. Many of its institutions were damaged physically by bombs, and specifically, there were military targets, defensive targets that made Iran weaker. So in order to be able to withstand or scare off or discourage future attacks by Israel, Iran had to beef up its defensive forces. So I think that kind of substitution, taking money away from other uses and putting it into the military, which may very well have been one of the reasons why the exchange rate was tumbling, seemed kind of a policy any government under the circumstances being under attack would take.
And looking at this document as well, the government is sort of increasingly reliant on tax revenues. What impact could this have on getting the economy working again? It seems almost counterintuitive.
Well, that's a very important point that you just pointed to, because the budget was kind of revealed about a month ahead of these protests. And it had a very chilling effect on the public perception of what lies ahead. I mean, they knew perhaps that things were not going to be that good. But when you raise taxes from 40%, about 40% of total expenditures to 57% of expenditures, that is big. Value-added taxes that are, in fact, kind of regressive because they affect they're based on consumption, so they raise a larger amount of money from the poor than the middle and higher income groups. The income taxes have become recently more progressive. Iran has never been good at collecting income taxes because it obviously depended on oil income. But now it is moving towards taxes. And naturally, that's very unpopular because, if you don't have a taxation system to which people and businesses are used to, we don't have this self-declaration system that the United States has, and people have gotten used to it. So you go to the businesses and you start looking at the books and you're trying to collect taxes, it becomes a tug of war between the tax collector and the business owner. And oftentimes they are trying to extract more revenues, so disputes arise. That is a point of tension with businesses. A bit like the points of tension that the Iranian governments have always had with businesses, but those have been over prices. Under the Shah, government employees or government agents used to walk around the stores and force sellers, grocery stores to lower their prices. Price gouging is a kind of a usual accusation that governments make against the private sector, against the business owners, which economists would tell you they're rarely the reason for inflation. Inflation is because the government prints more money. So I would say the tax pressure or increasing the tax pressure on the population at this time, with hindsight, it would seem unwise. And the worst part of the budget was to predict inflation rates of over 50%, government's own forecasts. And we observed inflation over 50% in this past few months. And then right in the budget, that salaries would increase by 20% maximum. That's not serious budget making. Of course, the parliament rejected that budget, and in the new budget, they allowed lower incomes to rise by 43%. So that was better. But the damage had been done in terms of people saying, we've had it. You're obviously unable to find a solution. And, we can talk about what other solutions exist. The demand from the public has been, both from politicians and ordinary people, why can't we compromise with the United States? The public perception was that they weren't getting a whole lot out of the nuclear program. And if it were up to them, I suppose they would have frozen enrichment to zero, as maybe costly it is in terms of national pride to have a foreign government order you what to do, and to not do something that the international community recognizes as your right to enrich peacefully. But those are all in the past. And I think what we have a situation now is that the government is unable to deal with the economic conditions under the circumstances defined by sanctions and by the threat of war.
So you mentioned the payments there and the currency crisis. We've got inflation. How does this translate into the ordinary Iranian citizen on the ground? How are they? Is there genuine hardship? And is that what's driving these protests? Is it similar to, say, Venezuela in some ways like that, where there seem to be real hardships? Or is Iran a different situation?
Well, I think the comparison with Venezuela is actually interesting. And Iran is very different from Venezuela. A lot of the migrants from Venezuela to Colombia, for example, are leaving because they can't make ends meet inside Venezuela. A lot of Iranians who leave seem to be the more educated people who are seeking more social freedoms, better jobs, and higher incomes. Iran is unique in the sense that its economic crisis has been met with a very flexible cash transfer program for the past 15 years. And because bread and some other items, food items, are subsidized, the cash enables people at least to buy enough bread to get the calories they want. So there is no real threat of hunger at the moment. Going forward, we don't know because now the economy is disrupted. But I would say Iran was running its economy a lot better than Venezuela. We didn't have the kind of inflation and hyperinflation. And the reason was, I think, that in Iran, there's a more serious government structure with a history of how to control the budget. They were not prepared for the severity of the sanctions. They underestimated what the United States could do in terms of limiting oil sales and other Iran's foreign trade. So they have been struggling in the last few years to get around the sanctions, not all that successfully. So they didn't pay attention to finding other solutions to the economy. They kept thinking, and this is my understanding, that one of these days we will find a way to defeat the sanctions and get away from having to compromise with the United States. And somehow that hasn't arrived in time.
And according to the Iran Central Bank, the country earned nearly $66 billion from exports of oil, petroleum products and gas in the last fiscal year. What impact would falling oil revenues have on the economy?
Well, it's huge because there are two kinds of exports Iran has. One are the exports from oil, which go directly to the government coffers. It enables the government to bring in the imports it wants at the prices it wants. Of course, that now is being phased out. But when the government has dollars, it can sell it to people who import the things it wants imported. So it has a lot of control over the expenditure part. And it can also control the exchange rate to some extent, although that doesn't work in the long run, but throwing money at people who are bidding the exchange rate in the free market to go higher and higher. The other exports Iran has are petrochemicals, a big chunk. Sometimes they're bigger in terms of dollar earnings than the oil. And the government has a role in that because it subsidizes the feed to these petrochemical plants, which is mostly natural gas, also owned and delivered by the government. Unfortunately, the companies are very large conglomerates that manage the petrochemical industry do not always bring the dollars back. They partly need the dollars to run their own operations, so they divert the dollars that they earn to the free market. And they earn a lot more, sometimes 50%, sometimes 100% more than they would get if they sold them to the government. Again, that is now being phased out so that the petrochemical owners, exporters, may well bring in more dollars back to Iran as opposed to investing it abroad. You know, the capital flood has been a big problem in Iran. So falling oil prices will affect governments' own revenues, but it wouldn't affect the petrochemical exports. Accepting more tightening of sanctions, seizing of ships on high seas and so on by the United States, that's always possible now that they have more excuses in terms of the losses of life and human rights violations taking place inside Iran. So in short, the impact of falling oil revenues is not that great on Iran. One, because Iran is kind of used to lower oil revenues. As we just mentioned, tax revenues have increased more than 50% of the revenues. And the other is that there are non-oil exports that are quite significant. And they are, of course, increasing coming under sanctions. You know, there's no reason why the United States cannot itemize all these petrochemicals and tell the Chinese or whoever else is buying it that you can't buy these either. So they become like oil, subject to a seizure on the high seas and so on. If that happens, it becomes harder to pull out of this crisis in a sort of using economics. And the government may be forced, if it insists, in further suppression of the protests. And the stakes will become higher in terms of loss of life and so on.
I think if we look at what happened in Venezuela recently, it's been a bit of a game changer in terms of oil producing countries and how they deal with China. You mentioned earlier that maybe China will come to the rescue of Iran. Do you think that countries like China are looking to Iran to meet a shortfall in oil needs following Venezuela? And given that Iran is so much more in China's strategic area than Venezuela. Venezuela is still very far away and a much smaller producer. How do you see the situation with China developing?
That's an excellent question. Iran has very close economic ties with China, but as far as I'm aware, there are no political ties like treaties that would tie Chinese behavior politically on the global stage to what's going on in Iran. One of the casualties of these demonstrations and the uprising is that the Chinese step back and they want to watch to see what's happening. They wouldn't like to sacrifice their standing with the United States, the ability to export globally, if the government seems to be losing ground. So that's one of the things that I would point to in terms of the future. China is probably more interested in its own economic trades, global trade, than it is on relationship with Iran. China can buy the oil it wants, even though Venezuela is kind of gone from the global market. I think few people recognize that there's an actual market where you can buy things. What may happen is that the price goes higher. You can't get concessions from Venezuela to have deliveries, a few dollars below the market rate. But I don't think China is tied to Iran or any particular country to buy its oil. That's something that international relation people who emphasize geopolitics and want to bring oil constantly emphasize that having political relationships with a country assures your supply. But I think luckily for the world, the oil market has become a real competitive market, and people are searching for buyers. If Chinese have $1 trillion or more in reserves, they are in a very good place to bid up the oil from other people. So I would say Chinese don't really need Iran that much. They need them if they want to have a club. China has invested in the BRICS, this group of countries that are more like the non-aligned nations of decades ago. And Iran is an important part of that. So that's, I think, the extent of Chinese diplomatic interest in Iran. They do find BRICS very useful in withstanding US pressure, and their claim to a multipolar world is partly based on having this alliance with rising nations, of which Iran is one, although at this moment is a very weak part of that BRICS. But I think China is definitely interested in preserving Iran as a member of BRICS in its orbit, however informally, but it's not willing to go to war for it. I don't know how much they have sent military hardware to Iran. People speculate about that. I don't have any information, but it's quite likely that they have been using the rail network to Iran to supply them with hardware that would beef up Iran's support. So that's, I think, the way Chinese would see in Iran in going forward. If it's going to get pulled out of this, it's a very valuable asset to have as a country that is leaning towards China rather than United States.
Finally then, maybe just to wrap things up, how do you see things unfolding in the next couple of days? I mean, I'm not asking you to look in the crystal ball, obviously, but based on the way events have been developing, how do you see things proceeding?
There's not going to be any change in the economy. I think all the cards have been played. What has to happen is, or what might happen, is a diplomatic opening. Iran apparently has contacted the United States. That's what President Trump has said. And maybe they will find a way for United States to make a deal without resorting to what he said a year ago about surrender. I mean, that's a way of preventing a relatively peaceful resolution to the current crisis. And I don't know how President Trump is looking at that. Another big player is the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu. He is not interested in any lifeline for the Iranian government because he's always wanted these other Middle Eastern countries to be weaker, smaller, so that Israel has genuine security, like long-term security, as opposed to having more of a democratic government in Iran, but still might be like Turkey and lean against Israel. I am not very optimistic that that could happen, but I think short of more repression to send people back home, two other avenues I can imagine. One in which some domestic reforms are announced in a hurry. I realize that when governments are under pressure, announcing reforms may sound like weakness, and there may be this lesson they learned from the Shah that you don't concede anything when people are in the streets. And the second is, which is more likely, is to see what the deal they can make with the United States that will reduce sanctions pressure on Iran without making Iran look like it has surrendered to the United States.
Thank you very much, Djavad. That was very interesting. Thanks, as always, for your insights today. That was Djavad Salehi-Isfahani speaking to us from Virginia today.
Thank you for having me.